Okay. So, you love all of your children that you have. When children are younger, when male children are younger, especially, they're mama's boys. And most of us that have, raised sons, I have a teenage son now, almost. In September, he'll be 13. He was my mama's boy. You couldn't leave me without hugging me 50 times and like wanting to snuggle all the time. But now, at almost 13, it's like, we're speaking different languages. Apparently, I have too many emotions and I want to talk too much. And he wants to be next to me, but he doesn't want me to acknowledge him. I don't know what that's all about, but I'm trying to read it, the whole situation, but hopefully just pray. But he thoroughly loves Chris, his father. He is, nothing his dad does is too overwhelming. Nothing his dad, men want to learn from their fathers how to be men. And that's just how it is. We get them back, I've been told, when they're older. They suddenly realize they still like us. So I'm hopeful on that aspect. But I think it's very important to look at Jacob and the fact that he wasn't loved by his father the way his brother Esau was. His identity was skewed, just like Xerxes' identity would have to be skewed, knowing that that his father wasn't really the rightful king and that he really wasn't the rightful heir to go to the throne. I mean, the Persia law was that the firstborn went to the throne, but because of who Atosa was and her political influence and Darius's love for her, Xerxes was given that. So there's some parallels there, but I want to move on to. Shh. Okay. Joseph and Xerxes were the favorite sons because their mothers were the favorite wives. But for Jacob, it was Rachel, and for Darius, it was Atosa. Because Joseph was beloved more than his brothers despised him. It's very easy to see this all throughout, Joseph's book, or all throughout his passages. His brothers did not like him, and his father made it very clear that he was the favorite son. Atosa was the favorite wife to King Darius, so you can venture to guess that most likely Xerxes' siblings didn't like him. I'm not sure if they had the exact kind of relationship, but I imagine that if you know your brother is the favorite child, he's going to be given a birthright that isn't his to have, that his mother is beloved more than your mother. Most likely, you're going to have that resentment, just as being humans, just thinking of humans in general, and looking at how Joseph's life was with his brothers and being the favorite child to the favorite woman, and then having to have this relationship that was so very broken with the other siblings. So, hold on. All three men had three other things in common. They were all full of pride. Joseph boasted about his dreams, giving no consideration to how his brothers would feel or view him. Jacob took a birthright through trickery and then fled to cover it up. And Xerxes called his wife to be presented like an item. He declared himself the king of kings. They were all blessed and chose. Oh, the third thing. They were all blessed and chosen by God. We know this because Joseph was chosen by God to save his people and other nations during the famine. Jacob was chosen by God, as scripture points out. Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated, because Esau had sold his birthright to Jacob. And Xerxes was a chosen king of the nation. In the book of Daniel, it says, the Lord removes kings and sets up others. So Xerxes was meant to be the king. God was blessing him. And they were all put through fire to face their pride and refine them in humility. Joseph lived as a slave for almost 2 decades. He was betrayed and sold by his own family. That sucks. Jacob was deceived by his father-in-law and was forced to work an additional years for free. Xerxes was faced with sign after sign about the failed conquest of Greece. His kingdom began to fail and loyalties were dissolving, which ultimately led to his assassination. So 2 of these men accepted the refinement but Xerxes did not. So again, and we can add in what we know from history about King Xerxes to the book of Esther, what we know there. Let's look at Xerxes' life outside of the book of Esther. So when Darius died, his eldest son claimed the throne. but it did not last long, as Xerxes was, with the support of his grandfather Cyrus's supporters, overthrew the eldest and placed Xerxes on the throne almost immediately. It wasn't really much effort for him. He was the king, and he knew he was going to be king, even though the eldest son really had right to that to claim to that throne. And the fact that he was able to place himself on the throne meant that these children, these other three sons that he had prior to his ascension to the throne, King Darius, they lived in the palace. So this son knew his brother was going to have his birthright that he was rightfully supposed to have as being the firstborn son. So hold on, I always lose my thought. So when King Xerxes had nothing to prove, being the son of the great Darius, King Darius, and also being the grandson of the great King Cyrus. Right from the beginning, people were behind him. The princes, all of his father's advisors, they fully supported King Xerxes rising and ascending the throne. So, but however, based off what his child and sibling relationship could have been like, and his constant striving to outdo what his father had done, clearly shows he did not actually feel that way about himself. So last week the topic was, I said it was going to be the insecure man behind the pompous king. So it's, I think it's pretty accurate. He was insecure. It's proven this by every time he got his architects going and had something construction. It would be something his father had already built, but he would build it bigger and grander. He wanted people to see him as better than he wanted to live up to the great King Darius's name. And most likely also overcompensating for the fact that he knew he wasn't the rightful king, that he wasn't the firstborn heir, that in the Persian law, that he was not the one to ascend the throne, and it was only through his mother being loved more than the other mothers that he was even there, and that most likely hurt his identity, how he viewed himself. Okay. Lost my train of thought. His father had established one of the strongest kingdoms known in that time, and it brought great strength and growth to the kingdom. From the very beginning, history states Xerxes focused a lot of time proving that he too was like his father, the king of kings. He had elaborate structures built, larger than his father's. He set out to conquer Greece multiple times, despite military financial strains and several advisors and omens showing how the conquest was doomed to fail. So despite all of Darius's accomplishments, he was never able to take Greece. So King Xerxes made that his mission. It was the one thing his father could not do. He taxed his people greatly, King Xerxes did, over the land of Persia to fund these military battles, these military raids. And they were all failures. And there were several signs or omens or whatever you want to call them that said that his advisors were able to look at, that his soldiers were able to look at as captains and say, this isn't going to be beneficial, this isn't going to be fruitful. But he refused, because it was the one thing his father couldn't do. He refused to give that up. He wanted to be the one king that overtook Greece. Okay, hold on a minute. He gave no concern for political or regional relationships that his father had. He had a statue from Babylon, the statue of Marduk. Some history states that it was carried off. Others say that he had it melted down, and people take that as he was removing an idol. But the reality of why he actually did that was because his father had always attended the festival every year, in which the Babylonians would give homage to this deity that they had erected, and he had kept good political relationships there. And Xerxes didn't want to go to the festival. He just basically didn't want. So he just had it taken away, because then they would stop asking him. If there's no statue to go worship, then nobody's going to ask you to go worship it or to be a part of the celebration. So it's interesting to see. He's kind of like a child in that aspect. He was just like, well, I don't want to do it, so I'm just going to make sure you can't do it either. That's kind of how I see it anyways. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but So after every failed attempt at Greece, Xerxes increased the taxes on the people, which began ultimately the economic decline of Persia's reign. He also commissioned a grander palace. So his father's palace still stood. It was still in great condition, but he refused. His architects, his closest advisors, told him, your dad's palace is top notch still, but he didn't care. He taxed the people further and declared that he was going to have a grander palace than even his father had. Um, so his last attempt at Greece was littered with so many signs that it was a bad idea to go after them and to succeed, and he ignored them all. His followers, however, did not. One of the commoners. I believe he was a commoner. I can't remember if it said, I think he was a commoner, but his sons were in the royal guard with King Xerxes. And he asked King Xerxes, may I have one of my sons to stay home with me so that when I'm old, I'll have at least one of them to care for me. Xerxes became enraged. He seen this as this guy was not supporting this conquest. He didn't believe it was going to succeed. So instead of allowing him to have one of his sons, he took that one son that he requested, cut him in half, placed him on either side of the road, and then marched his troops through the city when they were leaving to go attack Greece, past the body parts. So that was his response. So when we look at him in the book of Esther, he makes multiple poor choices. When we look at history statements, he makes multiple poor choices. He's no better or worse than Joseph or Jacob. They all made poor choices that ultimately helped to cast themselves into some refining fire. But the difference is that Jacob and Joseph had made poor choices, but they didn't have poor character because they submitted, they humbled themselves before God, to the point where Joseph, when he, where did that go? I guess I'm just winging it from here. But when Joseph, when he went through the refining fire, he went 18 years. He was still hurt and wounded. His brother showed up, and immediately all of that turmoil came back up in him, and he was up and down and battling with God with whether he was going to do the right thing. But ultimately, he did. Ultimately, he realized that his poor choices affected people. The same thing with Jacob. When he finally had to return, he went through the trickery for 14 years with his father-in-law. His father-in-law sounds like a swindler. And he had to eventually, God told him, you're going back. So he had to go back and face the brother that he had robbed. And he did. He recognized that his poor choices affected people. The difference is King Xerxes did not accept the humbling and the refining fire of breaking away that pride. He continued to have pride. He continued to make poor choices without the consideration of his people or of his guard. Or his army, or even relationships with other nations. He didn't care. He didn't care about the heavy tax burdens on people. He didn't care about the pain and emotions he was causing. Quite often, I think as women, as wives especially, we think we can have a Xerxes, kind of like just you do as I say, and if you don't, I'm kicking you out, or or a man that you just feel just is all about pay attention to me and I'm the best. And sometimes we have a hard time seeing first our own behavior, but the real question you have to ask yourself is, do they make poor choices or do they have poor character? Because poor choices are sins, which we all make. But poor character is the love of your sin, the refusal to see how your sin affects other people. If your man is being refined by God, if he's going through the fire and he's accepting that humbling each time, even if it's not in your time or in how you would do it, then you need to hold fast and you need to back off and allow God to continue to do that. If you got a man like Xerxes who doesn't care, then you need to get out, because that's the real difference there. So I think I covered it all as far as who Xerxes was. In my general opinion, he was a not a nice guy, and a really terrible husband, and probably a really terrible father to the rest, to his children. And ultimately, because of everything, his refusal to stop being prideful, stop being ridiculous, he was assassinated by a close advisor, and all of his sons were assassinated. And somebody else, one of his princes, who was close to him, that assassinated him, ascended at the throne and had his palace finished in his name. So ultimately, we can look at these three men's lives and see that they have some parallels there. Maybe not exactly, but some parallels there. And we can see how two men who chose to take the refining fire and the humbling process, and a man that didn't, and what the outcome is there. All right, so thanks for watching. Next, in a couple days, I think I'm going to save Esther and Vashti for the very end, and I'm going to do them in a two-part, because I think it's very important. But I think we're going to look at Haman the next video. All right, thank you for watching.